They say a son is a father's legacy, the living proof that you once walked this earth and left it a little better than you found it. But on my 63rd birthday, my legacy arrived on my front porch in a cardboard box that smelled of expensive glass and cold-blooded betrayal. I didn't know it then, but the moment I sliced through that packing tape, I was opening a door to a version of my life I wasn't sure I'd survive. I'd been awake since Nama. Bamuya. It's an old cop habit. One of those things 25 years on the Ridgeview force burns into your marrow. Even after 3 years of retirement, my body still runs on a clock that doesn't care about leisure. I was on my second cup of black coffee, watching the gray Oregon drizzle smear the windows of the kitchen Kate and I had remodeled together, when the FedEx truck rumbled down the driveway. Birthdays hadn't meant much since Kate passed 5 years ago. She was the one who made the fuss, baking that lemon cake that always sank in the middle and inviting neighbors I barely liked. Now, a birthday was just another Tuesday in October, where the silence in the house felt a little heavier than usual. I stepped onto the porch, the damp air biting through my flannel shirt, and picked up the package. It was heavier than it looked. No return address. Just my name and address in a font that looked too professional for a casual gift. Inside, nestled in enough foam peanuts to insulate a small shed, was a bottle of Blackthorn Crystal Reserve, Motngin Chin Cham Namui Hai. It wasn't just liquor, it was a work of art. The glass was cut into deep, rectangular grooves that caught the dim morning light, and the liquid inside was a rich, menacing amber. I'm a man who knows the value of things, and I knew immediately this wasn't something you'd find at the local corner store. I set it on the table and found the card tucked underneath. Cream-colored cardstock, handwritten. Happy birthday, Dad. I hope this makes up for lost time. Julian. My heart did a strange, stuttering skip against my ribs, partly from the shock of seeing his name, and partly from the underlying condition that had forced me into early retirement. I hadn't heard a word from Julian in 3 years. Not a phone call on Christmas, not a text when I had my bypass surgery, nothing. He'd moved to Portland for some high-stakes IT job and effectively vanished. And now, out of the blue, he sends a bottle worth. I checked the internet a moment later, nearly $4,000. $4,000 for a bottle of vodka. The detective in me, the part of my brain that never truly retired, started whispering. Julian was smart, but he was always the kid who forgot your birthday until the day after. He wasn't the type for grand, expensive gestures. Not unless he wanted something. I stared at the amber liquid, thinking about Kate. She'd always believed Julian would come back around. She used to say, "Archer, he's just like you, too stubborn to admit when he's wrong." But looking at that bottle, I didn't feel the warmth of reconciliation. I felt a cold knot tightening in my gut. I didn't open it. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. My heart medication, a steady regimen of nitroglycerin and blood pressure stabilizers, didn't play nice with alcohol. If I took a single shot of that bone, hum liquid, I'd likely be spending my birthday in a hospital bed. Julian knew that. He'd been there for the first scare in Hang In Le Haimui Mot. He'd seen the pill bottles on my nightstand. By bone. Home PM. The silence of the house was getting to me, so I grabbed the box and headed into town. I had an appointment with David Whitmore, my attorney, and the closest thing I had to a best friend. We were supposed to review some estate paperwork, a routine update I'd been putting off since Kate's funeral. David's office was in one of those old brick buildings on Main Street that smelled of lemon polish and ancient law books. He looked up from his desk as I walked in, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Archer, you old dog. 63? You're catching up to me," David chuckled, standing up to shake my hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like a house with a leaky roof, David. Managing everything," I said, setting the box on his desk. "I brought you something. Consider it a thank you for keeping my affairs in order all these years." David's eyebrows shot up as he pulled the bottle from the foam. He whistled, a long, low sound of genuine shock. "Blackthorn Motngin Chin Cham Namui Hai. Archer, I can't accept this. This is a $4,000 bottle of vodka. My son sent it. I can't drink the stuff, and I'd rather see it go to someone who actually appreciates a good pour," I told him, trying to ignore the way my chest felt tight. Besides, Julian's paying for it apparently. Might as well enjoy his success. David looked at the bottle, then at me. "You still haven't talked to him?" "Just the card in the box. Makes up for lost time," he says. "I'm not sure $4,000 covers 3 years of silence, but maybe that's the new math they teach in Portland." David sighed, setting the bottle on a side table. Well, let's look at your file first, then we'll crack the seal. I've had a hell of a day with a probate case, and I think a drop of this might be the only thing that saves my sanity. He turned to his computer, his fingers dancing across the keys. David was old school, but he'd moved everything to a secure cloud system a few years back. He clicked into my folder, but then he stopped. He leaned in closer to the screen, his brow furrowing. That's strange, he muttered. What is? I was looking for the Hangin Lehaimui draft we did after Kate passed, but there's a new entry here. An updated will, digitally signed and filed on August Mui Lumpth. I felt the blood drain from my face. August? David, I haven't been in this office since January, and I sure as hell didn't sign anything digitally. David's face went pale. He clicked the file open. The document on the screen looked identical to my official will, the same font, the same legal headers. But the distribution clause had been completely rewritten. In my original will, the estate was split Namui between Julian and my granddaughter, Emma, with a trust set up for her education. This new document, it left 100% of my assets, the house, and the Numchum, home life insurance policy, to Julian. Archer, David whispered, his voice trembling. Someone hacked my firm's portal. This was uploaded from an external IP, and look at the signature. It was a digital recreation of my signature. It looked perfect. Too perfect. My heart began to thud, a dull, rhythmic H against my ribs. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the plastic of my pill bottle. We need to call the police, I said, the old detective in me taking over. This is fraud, David. This is identity theft. Wait, David said, his hand shaking as he reached for the blackthorn bottle. Let me just get my head straight for a second. My system's been compromised. If they got into your file, they might have gotten into others. He broke the seal on the bottle. A soft click-pop echoed in the quiet office. The scent hit me immediately, sharp, clean, but with an underlying sweetness that felt almost medicinal. David grabbed 2 crystal tumblers from his bar cart. I know you can't have any, he said, pouring about 2 inches into one glass, but I need a moment of clarity before I call the tech guys. He took a sip, then a larger one. Smooth, he whispered, staring at the glass. God, that's dangerously smooth. He sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, trying to trace the upload path of the forged will. I watched him, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios. How did Julian get David's login? How did he know about the specific language of my estate? 10 minutes passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the computer and the rain against the glass. Then, David's hand jerked. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The bone, hung vodka pooled around his shoes like a puddle of liquid gold. David? I stood up, my heart hammering. He didn't answer. He was staring at me, but his eyes weren't focusing. His face had turned a terrifying shade of gray, and his chest was heaving, as if he were trying to swallow air through a straw. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He grabbed his chest, his fingers clawing at his shirt, and then he collapsed forward onto the desk, knocking over his monitor. David, talk to me. I scrambled around the desk, reaching for my phone to dial Chin Chum Mort. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I checked his pulse. It was thready, erratic, jumping like a trapped bird. He was having a massive cardiac event, or something worse. As I waited for the operator to pick up, my eyes drifted to the bottle of Blackthorn sitting innocently on the side table. The amber liquid looked darker now, like a warning I'd ignored. I looked at the glass shards on the floor. My phone buzzed in my hand. It wasn't the Chin Chum Mort operator. It was a text from an unknown number. Did you like the vodka, Dad? I thought it was time we settled things. I looked at David's limp body, then back at the phone. My son hadn't sent me a gift. He'd sent me a death warrant, and I had just handed it to my best friend. The sirens were the loudest thing in the room, but the silence between my ears was deafening. I remember the paramedics' boots thumping on David's hardwood floor, the way the red and blue lights strobed against the framed diplomas on his wall, making it look like the room was pulsing with a heartbeat David no longer had. They worked on him right there on the rug, the bone, hung vodka soaking into his expensive wool trousers, while I stood in the corner, my hands shoved deep into my pockets so no one would see them shaking. Archer, stay back, a voice said. It was Frank Miller, my old partner. He'd made detective 2 years before I retired, and now he was the one holding the yellow tape. He looked at me with a mix of pity and the professional suspicion that comes with 20 years of seeing the worst in people. "I gave it to him, Frank," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "It was a gift, for my birthday." Frank looked at the bottle on the side table, then back at me. "We'll talk at the station, Archer. Right now, let the medics do their job." They wheeled David out, his face a mask of gray, oxygen mask fogging with every shallow, desperate breath. I watched them go, feeling like the floor was tilting beneath me. My phone was still heavy in my hand, that text message from Julian burning a hole through the screen. "Did you like the vodka, Dad? I thought it was time we settled things." I didn't answer it. The detective in me knew that the moment I replied, I was tipping my hand. Julian thought I was the one on that stretcher. He thought he was finally free of the old man and the rules, and the estate that stood between him and whatever debt was drowning him. I sat in the back of a patrol car, a seat I'd put 1,000 people in, but never occupied myself, and stared out at the rainy streets of Ridge View. As we drove toward the station, my mind drifted back to the last time I'd seen Julian. It was 3 years ago, just a few months after Kate's funeral. The grief was still a raw, open wound in that house. I was spending my days staring at her empty chair, and Julian. Julian was spending his days looking at her jewelry box and the deed to the house. He'd come to me asking for a $50,000 investment for a tech startup in Portland. He'd sat at the same kitchen table where I'd later open his poisoned gift, spinning a web of jargon about blockchain and proprietary algorithms. I'd looked into his eyes that looked just like Kate's, and I saw something that wasn't there when he was a boy. I saw a hunger that didn't have a bottom. "Julian," I'd said, my voice heavy with the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many scams. "I'm not a bank. This is the money your mother and I saved for our retirement. It's what's supposed to take care of me now that she's gone." "It's an investment, Dad," he'd snapped, his face hardening into a mask of resentment. "You always were so small town. You think holding on to every penny is the same thing as being safe. You're just sitting in this house, waiting to die while the world moves on without you." "I'm sitting in this house because it's my home," I replied, "and I'm not giving you $50,000 for a pipe dream." That was the night the silence started. He'd packed a bag, walked out the door, and didn't look back. No phone calls, no letters, just a void where a sun should have been. I'd spent 3 years wondering if I'd been too hard on him, if Kate would have wanted me to just give him the money. I'd blamed myself for the distance, thinking I'd policed him instead of fathering him. I didn't know then that the distance was the only thing keeping me alive. The interrogation room was cold. Frank sat across from me, a legal pad between us. He didn't turn on the recorder, not yet. He was giving me the old partner grace period. "Archer," the medic said, "David's symptoms look like acute poisoning. Cardiac arrhythmia, respiratory distress, neurological tremors. It hit him fast." "It was the vodka, Frank," I said, leaning forward. "Julian sent it. I have the card, I have the FedEx box, and I have a text message he sent me 10 minutes after David collapsed." I slid my phone across the table. Frank read the message, his jaw tightening. "He thinks you drank it. He knows I have a heart condition. He knows I'm on nitro. He knew that if I drank that, it wouldn't just be a hangover. It would be a funeral." I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my own chest, the familiar pressure of my angina flaring up under the stress. I reached for my pocket, fumbled with my pill bottle, and slid a tablet under my tongue. The bitter taste was a reminder of my own fragility, a fragility my son was trying to exploit. "Why, Archer?" Frank asked. "Why now? 3 years of nothing, and then he tries to take you out with a bottle of booze." "Because of the will," I said, my voice gaining strength as the medication took hold. "David found a forged will in his system today. Someone hacked his firm. The new will leaves everything to Julian. No trust for Emma, no split, just him." Frank whistled. "The life insurance, the house, that's nearly $1 million in assets, Archer. And Julian was always a gambler," I whispered, a memory surfacing. "Even as a kid, he'd bet his lunch money on anything. I thought he'd outgrown it. I thought the IT job was his way of being serious. But a guy like that, he doesn't outgrow the hunger. He just finds bigger stakes." The door opened, and a young officer stepped in, looking pale. He whispered something to Frank. Frank's face went stone cold. He looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, I saw fear in my partner's eyes. "What is it?" I asked. The lab did a preliminary screen on the residue in David's glass. It wasn't just alcohol, Archer. It was laced with aconitine. They call it Queen of Poisons. It's a neurotoxin. It stops the heart by locking the sodium channels. In a man with your condition, I'd have been dead before I hit the floor. I finished for him. There's more, Frank said, leaning in. David isn't stable. He's in a coma. And his wife, Margaret, she's at the hospital. Archer. She's asking why you gave her husband a bottle of poison. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. David was my brother in everything but blood. He'd stood by me through Kate's cancer, held me up at the funeral, and now he was dying in my place because of a gift my son had intended for me. I need to go to the hospital, I said, standing up. You can't, Frank said, grabbing my arm. You're a person of interest, Archer. I know you didn't do this, but the paperwork says you handed the bottle to him. Until we can trace that FedEx package back to Julian's doorstep in Portland, you stay here. Frank, he's going to call, I said, pointing at my phone. He's waiting for the news. He's waiting for the tragic accident to hit the Ridgeview Gazette. If I don't answer, or if the police show up at his door too early, he'll vanish. He's a tech guy. He knows how to erase himself. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we give him what he wants, I said, a cold resolve settling over me. I'm suggesting we tell the world I'm dead. Frank stared at me. Archer, that's a massive risk. If he finds out you're faking, he won't. He's arrogant. He thinks he's the smartest person in any room. He thinks his old man is a relic of the past. I looked at my reflection in the interrogation room mirror. I looked old. I looked tired. I looked like a man who was ready to be a ghost. We put out a press release. Retired officer collapses on birthday. Keep it vague. Let him think he won. Frank was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. I'll talk to the chief. But Archer, if we do this, you're officially off the grid. You stay in a safe house. No calls. No contact. Especially not with Sarah and Emma. My heart ached at the thought of my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter. Emma was only 10. If she thought I was gone, she has to know the truth eventually, Frank. Eventually. But right now we need Julian to feel safe enough to come out of the shadows. We need him to come to Ridgeview to claim his inheritance. The plan was set in motion. By midnight, the local news was running a crawler about my sudden passing. I was moved to a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town, a place used for witnesses who were too scared to go home. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the flickering neon sign from the parking lot casting long, rhythmic shadows across the wall. I thought about Julian. I thought about the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the boy who'd cried when he scraped his knee, the boy who'd grown into a man capable of calculated murder. How does a father mourn a son who is still breathing, but has been dead inside for years? I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David collapsing. I saw the look on Margaret's face. I saw the amber liquid in that beautiful, deadly bottle. At ba, muy lam a, am, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a phone call. From Julian. My breath caught in my throat. My thumb hovered over the accept button. Frank's instructions echoed in my head. Don't answer. Let it go to voicemail. Let him think the police have the phone. But then, a second text followed the call. I know you're not dead, Dad. You always were too stubborn to die on the first try. But David was always the weak one, wasn't he? Tell me, does Margaret know it was your gift that killed him? Or should I tell her myself? The room went cold. I realized then that I wasn't playing a game with a desperate gambler. I was in a war with a psychopath. Julian wasn't waiting for me to die. He was enjoying the destruction he was causing while I was still alive to watch it. I looked at the phone, my finger trembling. He knew. He'd been watching. Maybe he was even in Ridgeview. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, staring out into the dark, rainy parking lot. That's when I saw it. A silver sedan, parked under a broken street lamp at the far end of the lot. The headlights were off, but the engine was idling, a faint plume of exhaust rising into the cold air. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I'd set for my son had just become a cage for me, and the person sitting in that car wasn't Julian. I didn't move from the window. The silver sedan sat there, its engine a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards of the motel room. I knew that car. It didn't belong to my son. It belonged to Sarah, Julian's wife, my daughter-in-law. The last time I'd seen her was at a distance, through a window in Portland a year ago when I'd driven 3 hours just to catch a glimpse of my granddaughter, Emma, playing in the park. Julian hadn't known I was there. I'd watched Sarah from the shadows of my truck, noticing how thin she'd become, how the easy laughter she'd once shared with my son had been replaced by a constant, wary scanning of her surroundings. Even then, I'd sensed she was living in a house made of glass, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. I grabbed my jacket and slipped the Smith Wesson into the small of my back. If Frank found out I was breaking cover, he'd have my badge, even the retired one. But Sarah being here, at Bomley in the morning at a safe house, only the police should know about, meant the glass house had finally shattered. I stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had turned into a fine, stinging mist. I moved down the stairs, keeping to the shadows of the vending machines, my heart doing that heavy, irregular gallop that the doctors warned me about. I reached the car and tapped on the driver's side window. Sarah jumped, a strangled cry escaping her as she looked up. When she saw it was me, she didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. She fumbled with the locks, and I slid into the passenger seat. The interior of the car smelled of stale coffee and the floral perfume Kate used to buy her for Christmas. "Archer," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They said you were dead. The news. Julian told me you were gone." "I'm not dead, Sarah. Not yet." I looked at her closely. There was a faint yellowing bruise along her jawline, partially hidden by her hair. "How did you find me? How did you know I was here?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, black device, a GPS tracker. "I found this in Julian's glove box a week ago. I didn't know what it was at first. But tonight, while he was on the phone, I saw a notification on his tablet. It was a map, a red dot right here, at this motel. He's been tracking someone's phone. I thought it was a private investigator he hired to follow you. I didn't think he'd lead me to a ghost." A cold realization settled in my chest. Julian hadn't just hacked David's office. He'd cloned my phone, or installed a tracker on my truck months ago. He'd been watching me for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment to send that bottle. "Sarah, where is Emma?" I asked, my voice tight. "She's with my mother in Eugene. I told Julian I was going there to clear my head. Archer, he's not the man I married. He hasn't been for a long time." She leaned her head against the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking. "It started with the business trips. He'd come back with these wild stories about venture capitalists and tech mergers. But then the mail started coming. Past due notices, collection agencies, and then the phone calls in the middle of the night. I thought back to the early warning signs I'd ignored. The way Julian had suddenly traded his sensible sedan for a luxury SUV he couldn't afford. The way he'd stopped talking about his work and started talking about leverage and liquidity. I'd seen it 100 times on the force, the downward spiral of a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. "He lost everything, didn't he?" I said. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "He lost the savings. He lost the college fund for Emma, and then he borrowed money from people you don't borrow money from. He told me it was a bridge loan, just to get him through a rough patch. But then Vinny started showing up." "Vinny?" "Vinny Russo. He's a consultant for some firm in Portland. But he doesn't carry a briefcase, Archer. He carries a heavy ring on his pinky and a look in his eyes that makes my skin crawl. He's been at the house twice this month. The second time, Julian stayed in his office for 3 hours. When he came out, he told me we were going to be fine. He said he'd found a way to settle the debt in full." She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "He said you were sick. He said you'd reached out to him and told him you wanted to change your will to help us. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think he was finally being a son to you again. He was settling the debt all right," I growled, "with my life insurance." The silence in the car was heavy. I looked out at the motel, the vacancy sign buzzing like a trapped insect. I realized then that Julian hadn't just sent the vodka to kill me. He'd sent it to test his new power. If it worked, he got the money. If it failed, he'd already laid the groundwork to blame me for David's death. He was playing both sides of the board. "Sarah, you can't go back to him," I said, "if he knows you're here." "He doesn't. I left my phone at the house. I used an old burner I kept hidden." She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Archer, there's something else. In his office, in the shredder bin, I found fragments of a document. It wasn't about the will, it was about Kate." My heart stopped. "What about Kate?" "It was a life insurance policy. A second one I didn't know existed. It was taken out 3 months before she died. Julian's name was the sole beneficiary. Archer, it was for $200,000. The world seemed to tilt. Kate's death had been a long, agonizing slide into the dark. Cancer is a thief, but it's a slow one. I'd been there for every chemo session. Every night she cried out in pain. Every morning she couldn't get out of bed. Julian had been there too. He'd been the one who brought her tea. He'd been the one who organized her medication when I was too exhausted to see straight. He was in charge of her pills. I whispered, the memory hitting me like a physical blow. The last 3 months, he took over her palliative care so I could keep working to pay for the private nurses. I found a receipt for a pharmacy in a different county, Sarah said, her voice trembling, for a drug called propranolol. It's a beta blocker. If someone was already weak, already fighting for breath. I couldn't breathe. The air in the car felt like it had been replaced by lead. I remembered those final weeks. Kate had seemed to be rallying, her spirits high, and then suddenly she'd slipped into a respiratory crisis she never woke up from. The doctors had called it a natural progression. I'd called it God being merciful. But it hadn't been God. It had been Julian. My son hadn't just tried to kill me. He'd practiced on his own mother. The rage that surged through me wasn't the hot, explosive kind I'd felt as a young cop. It was cold. It was ancient. It was the kind of rage that turns a man into a weapon. I looked at Sarah, seeing the same realization dawning in her eyes. We weren't just dealing with a gambler. We were dealing with a monster we'd both helped create by loving him too much. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from miles away. You are going to Eugene. You are going to take Emma, and you are going to stay with your mother. Don't tell her anything. Don't call anyone. I'm going to call Frank, and he's going to send a unit to watch the house. What are you going to do? I'm going to stop being a ghost, I said, reaching for the door handle, and I'm going to start being a detective again. I stepped out of the car, watching as Sarah backed out of the lot and disappeared into the mist. I stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking through my shirt, feeling the weight of the revolver against my spine. I walked back up to my room, but I didn't go inside. I went to the truck parked 2 stalls down my old Chevy. I knelt by the rear wheel well and ran my hand along the frame. My fingers brushed against something small, cold and plastic, a magnetic tracker. I pulled it off and held it in my palm. It was a high-end model, the kind used by professional skip tracers. Julian was watching the red dot. He was waiting for it to move to the cemetery, or the police station, or back to my empty house. I looked at the tracker, and then I looked at the dark woods that lined the edge of the motel property. A plan began to form, a way to lure the monster out of his den. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to give Julian exactly what he wanted, a chance to finish the job. I walked to the edge of the woods and tossed the tracker into the back of a long-haul semi-truck that was idling near the entrance, its driver inside the diner grabbing a coffee. The truck was headed east, toward the mountains. In an hour, Julian would see me driving away from Ridge View, heading toward the middle of nowhere. I went back to my room, grabbed my gear, and called Frank. Frank, it's Archer. Change of plans. I'm breaking cover. Archer, stay put. We're almost there with the warrant. He killed Kate. Frank, I said, my voice cracking. He didn't just let her go. He helped her. And he's coming for me next. There was a long silence on the other end. How do you know? I just do. Listen to me. I'm going to the old cabin on Miller's Creek. Tell the boys to stay back. If he sees a squad car, he'll spook. I need him to think I'm alone. I need him to think he's won. Archer, that's suicide. You're not a field officer anymore. Your heart. My heart is the only bait I've got, Frank. Just do this for me. For Kate. I hung up before he could argue. I drove my truck, the other one, the old beater I kept in the garage that wasn't being tracked, out the back exit of the motel. The drive to Miller's Creek took 40 minutes. The cabin was a ruin, a place Kate and I had bought decades ago and never fixed up. It was isolated, surrounded by dense pines, and the rushing sound of the rain-swollen creek. It was the perfect place for a reckoning. I parked a mile away and hiked in, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the pain in my chest a constant, dull reminder of my mortality. I reached the cabin, pushed open the rotting door, and sat in the darkness, the Smith, Wesson heavy in my lap. An hour passed, then 2. The rain stopped, leaving the woods in a dripping, expectant silence. And then, I heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires, a car door closing. I held my breath, my finger resting on the trigger. The floorboards of the porch creaked. The door swung open, a silhouette framed against the moonlight. "I knew the tracker was a decoy, Dad," a voice said. A voice I'd loved for 30 years. "You always were a better cop than a father. But you forgot one thing." The silhouette stepped into the room, and I saw the glint of a barrel in his hand, but it wasn't Julian. It was Vinny Russo. And he wasn't alone. "Julian says hello," Vinny sneered, stepping aside. "But he's a busy man. He's already at the bank, signing the papers for your estate. He sent us to make sure the ghost stays a ghost." My blood ran cold. Julian wasn't coming. He'd sent the professionals to clean up his mess while he was miles away, creating an airtight alibi. "Where is he?" I rasped, raising my revolver. "He's exactly where you can't touch him," Vinny said, raising his own weapon. "But don't worry, you'll be seeing your wife soon. Julian told me to tell you, she was a lot easier to kill than you are." As Vinny pulled the trigger, the back window of the cabin shattered, and a flashbang detonated, filling the small room with blinding white light and a roar that felt like the end of the world. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my son's business partners. The ringing in my ears was a high, thin scream that drowned out the world. For a few seconds, time didn't exist, only a blinding white void and the smell of ozone and burnt powder. I'd felt flashbangs before on the job, but when you're 63 with a heart that's already trying to quit on you, it feels less like a tactical tool and more like a physical assault. I was on the floor. I didn't remember falling, but the grit of the cabin's rotted floorboards was pressed against my cheek. My vision was a smear of charcoal and silver. I tried to reach for my Smith, Wesson, but my arm felt like it belonged to someone else, a heavy, useless weight trailing in the dust. Through the haze, I saw silhouettes moving, fast and jagged like broken film. "Move, move, move." The voices were muffled, as if they were shouting through 3 feet of water. I realized then that Frank hadn't listened. He hadn't stayed back. But as my sight began to clear, I saw the men in tactical gear weren't wearing Ridgeview PD patches. They were wearing plain black, no insignias, no identification. And they weren't pointing their weapons at Vinny, they were flanking him. Vinny Russo stood in the center of the room, completely unfazed. He wasn't blinded. He'd been wearing high-end tactical goggles that he was now sliding up onto his forehead. He looked down at me, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or maybe just pity crossing his face. "I told you, Detective," Vinny said, his voice finally breaking through the ringing in my ears. "Julian's a busy man. He doesn't like loose ends. And he doesn't trust local cops to do a professional's job." "Frank," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was lined with glass. "Where's Frank?" Vinny smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "Detective Miller is currently sitting in a ditch 3 miles back with a punctured tire and a radio that doesn't work. We didn't hurt him. We just delayed him. Julian wanted this kept in the family." One of the men in black stepped forward and kicked my revolver across the room. It skittered over the floorboards and disappeared into the shadows beneath an old wood-burning stove. I was defenseless, pinned to the floor by my own failing body and the weight of a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined. What happened next changed the way I thought about my son forever. Vinny reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen and propped it up on a crate so I could see it. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, high-definition feed of a sterile hallway. I recognized it immediately. Ridgeview General, the ICU wing. The camera was positioned low, likely a button cam on someone's shirt. The person wearing it was walking toward room Bonchumwe High, David's room. My breath hitched. I watched as the gloved hand of the person on screen reached out and pushed the door open. David was there, a tangle of tubes and wires, the steady beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor the only sign of life in the quiet room. He looked so small, so fragile. The person with the camera walked right up to the bed. They didn't hesitate. They reached for the IV line. "No," I choked out, trying to push myself up. My chest flared with white-hot pain, a warning shot from my heart that I was reaching my limit. "Vinny, stop this." "It's not me you should be talking to," Vinny said. He tapped the tablet again, and a voice came through the speakers, a voice that was calm, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar. "Hello, Dad. I see you made it to the cabin. You always loved that old shack. Such a pity you never fixed the roof." Julian's voice was coming from the tablet, but it felt like he was standing right behind me, whispering in my ear. He sounded happy, relieved. "Julian," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. I know about the debt. I know about the Benedis. We can fix it. I have money in the Bonchum Leamok. I can sell the house." "Oh, Dad, always thinking so small," Julian interrupted, his tone mocking. "This stopped being about the 300 grand weeks ago. That was just the catalyst. Once I realized how easy it was to manipulate David's system, once I realized how much you'd left me in that will, I started thinking bigger. Why settle for clearing a debt when I could start over, truly over?" On the screen, the gloved hand pulled a small syringe from a pocket. It was filled with a clear, colorless liquid. "Is that the propranolol, Julian?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The same thing you used on your mother?" The line went silent for a heartbeat. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. When Julian spoke again, the playfulness was gone. His voice was as sharp as a scalpel. "She was suffering, Dad. You were too weak to see it. You would have let her linger for months, watching her wither away until there was nothing left but a ghost. I gave her peace. And I gave myself the capital I needed to start my firm. It was a win-win. But you were always the problem. You and your honor. You and your duty. You spent 40 years judging everyone, including me. Well, now the jury's back, and the verdict is in." "You're a monster," I said. "I'm a pragmatist. And right now, the most pragmatic thing is to clear the board. David knows too much about the digital signatures. Sarah knows too much about the business trips. And you just won't die." On the tablet, the syringe moved toward the port in David's A4. My heart was thundering now, a frantic, irregular beat that made the world start to gray at the edges. I knew I was having an attack. I reached for my pocket, for the new bottle of nitroglycerin Dr. Brennan had given me. Vinny saw the movement. He stepped forward and crushed my hand under his boot. "Aha," Vinny tutted. "Julian wants you to feel this. All of it." "Julian, please," I gasped, the pain in my chest turning into a crushing weight. "Don't hurt David. He's like a father to you." "A father?" Julian laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "He was a witness, Dad. That's all. And now he's a liability. Watch closely. This is what happens to people who stand in my way." The hand on the screen pressed the plunger. I watched the clear liquid enter the tube, traveling slowly toward David's arm. I closed my eyes, a sob breaking in my throat, but Vinny grabbed my hair and forced my head up. "Look at it," Vinny hissed. I looked. The heart monitor's beep began to accelerate. Beep, 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 beep. David's body gave a small, violent twitch. And then, the sound I'll hear in my nightmares, until the day I die. The long, flat P and the flat line. "One down," Julian's voice said over the speaker. "Now, for the main event. Vinny, finish it. Make it look like he had a heart attack during the struggle. I've already sent the text from his phone to the police department saying he couldn't live with the guilt of David's death. It's a tragedy, really. The retired cop who couldn't handle the pressure." Vinny reached for his weapon, his face a mask of professional indifference. He looked at me, and I saw the end. I saw the dark mouth of the barrel, the cold dust of the cabin floor, and the image of my best friend's dead face on a tablet screen. I didn't know it yet, but Julian had made one fatal mistake in his airtight plan. He'd assumed I was the only one who'd learned how to be a ghost. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin didn't just open, it disintegrated. A hail of gunfire tore through the rotted wood, catching the two men in black before they could even raise their rifles. They went down hard, their tactical gear no match for the high-caliber rounds. Vinny dove for cover behind the crate, his tablet clattering to the floor. I stayed flat, my hands over my head, as the room filled with smoke and the thunderous roar of a tactical breach. But it wasn't the police. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing an old, grease-stained Carhartt jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He held a custom-modified AR Muilem with a suppressor, moving with a fluid, lethal grace I hadn't seen in 20 years. It was Frank Miller. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came two more men, older, gray-haired, moving with the synchronized precision of a team that had worked together in the dark for decades. It was the old guard, the guys Julian thought were relics, the retired detectives Julian had dismissed as obsolete. "Archer, get down," Frank bellowed. Vinny popped up from behind the crate, firing blindly. One of the retirees caught a round in the shoulder, spinning him back. but Frank didn't flinch. He laid down a suppressive fire that chewed the crate to splinters. Vinny, seeing the odds, scrambled for the back window, the same one he'd cut earlier. He disappeared into the night before Frank could get a clear shot. Frank was at my side in a second, his rough hands checking my pulse. "Stay with me, Archer. Don't you dare quit on me now." "David," I choked out, pointing at the tablet. "Julian, he was at the hospital. He killed him. Frank." Frank looked at the flat line on the screen. His jaw tightened until I thought his teeth might crack. He didn't say a word. He just pulled a radio from his pocket, a real one, not the one Vinny thought they'd jammed. "Echo 1 to base. Target is mobile. Repeat, Julian Castellano is at Ridgeview General ICU. Code red. He's armed and highly dangerous. Take him down." I looked at Frank, confused. "Target, mobile? You knew he was there?" "We've been tracking his car since Sarah left the motel, Archer," Frank said, his voice a low growl. "We didn't know about the poison in the room, but we had the ICU locked down. That cam feed Julian was watching, it wasn't live. It was a loop we fed into his system 10 minutes ago." The world seemed to stop spinning for a second. "A loop? Then, David?" "David's in a secure wing on the 3rd floor, Archer. He's fine. The guy in that bed was a decoy, a medical dummy we rigged with a heart monitor." The relief was so sharp it was almost as painful as the angina. I slumped back against Frank's chest, the tears finally coming. David was alive. The flat line had been a lie. But then, the radio crackled again. "Base to Echo 1. We have a problem. Target didn't go to the ICU. He pulled into the parking lot, saw the perimeter, and doubled back. He's headed west, Frank. High speed." "West?" Frank looked at me, his eyes widening. "West toward what?" I knew the answer before he even finished the question. There was only one thing west of the hospital that Julian still cared about. One piece of collateral he hadn't burned yet. "The school," I whispered, the cold returning 10 times stronger than before. "He's going for Emma." Julian wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was going to take the only thing I had left to bargain with. What happened next changed the stakes from a legal battle to a race against a man who had nothing left to lose. The roar of the engine was the only thing keeping me upright. Frank had me in the back of his sedan, his hand clamped on my shoulder as he barked orders into the radio. The old guard was in pursuit, 3 cars tearing through the rain-slicked mountain passes like a pack of wolves, but the lead was slipping. Julian was driving a high-performance SUV he'd bought with money he didn't have, and he was driving it like a man who had already accepted his own death. "He's not going to Eugene," I rasped, clutching the door handle as Frank took a corner on 2 wheels. "Frank, listen to me. He's not going to Sarah's mother. Archer, the GPS on Sarah's car." "He knows about the GPS," I shouted, the effort sending a spike of fire through my chest. "He's been 3 steps ahead of us the whole time. Think like him, Frank. He just saw his assassins fail. He saw his hospital play turn into a trap. He's humiliated. He doesn't want the money anymore. He wants to hurt me. He wants to leave me with nothing." I looked out the window as the first signs of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, a bruised, sickly purple. I knew exactly where he was going. Not to a school, not to a grandmother's house. He was going to the place where the silence between us first began. The ridge. It was a lookout point 4 miles north of town, a sheer drop into the gorge. It was where I'd taken him for his first camping trip. It was where we'd buried Kate's ashes. It was the only place left that still had a piece of our family's soul attached to it. And I knew, with the terrifying certainty of a father who had raised a predator, that Sarah and Emma were already there. "The ridge," Frank whispered, the realization hitting him. He keyed the radio. "All units, redirect to Miller's Point. High priority. Target may have hostages." Hostages. The word made my stomach turn. My granddaughter, a 10-year-old girl who still believed her father was a hero, was now a pawn in his final, desperate gambit. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It felt like a live wire in my hand. I didn't wait for him to call. I dialed his number. He picked up on the first ring. The sound of wind rushing past a window filled the line, punctuated by the high, thin sound of a child sobbing. "You're late, Dad," Julian said. He sounded breathless, his voice pitched in a manic, terrifying register. "I thought you'd be faster. All those years of telling me how a real detective stays vigilant. You're getting slow." "Julian, let them go," I said, my voice forced into a calm I didn't feel. "This is between you and me. Sarah has nothing to do with this. Emma certainly doesn't. You're her father, for God's sake." "I was a lot of things, Archer. I was a son once, too. Remember that? I was the kid who waited for you on the porch every night, hoping you'd come home before I went to sleep. But you were always busy. You were always cleaning up the streets. Well, look at the streets now. They're a mess. I'm coming to you, Julian, alone. Tell Frank to pull the cars back. I'll walk up that ridge myself. Just let the girls walk away. You don't get to negotiate anymore. He screamed, the sound distorting the phone's speaker. You think this is a hostage situation? This is a family outing, Dad. We're just watching the sunrise. One last time. The line went dead. Frank looked at me, his face grim. He's unhinged, Archer. We can't let you go in there alone. SWAT is 10 minutes out. 10 minutes is too long, I said. And before Frank could stop me, I reached over and grabbed the wheel, jerking it toward the shoulder. The car fishtailed, gravel spraying against the undercarriage as Frank fought to regain control. What the hell are you doing? Pull over, I commanded, the old authority of my sergeant days coming back in a rush. He's watching the road. If he sees the convoy, he'll jump. He'll take them both over the edge. I have to go up the back trail. The back trail? Archer, that's a 2-mile climb. Your heart. My heart will do exactly what I tell it to do until this is finished, I snapped. Frank stared at me for a heartbeat, then cursed and slammed the car into park. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a backup piece, a Glock Muichin. He handed it to me, along with an extra mag. 1 mile back, there's a service road for the cell tower. It cuts into the ridge from the north. If you can make the climb, you'll come out behind the memorial bench. But Archer, if you feel the pain, you stop. You hear me? I didn't answer. I took the gun, checked the chamber, and stepped out into the cold, gray morning. The climb was a nightmare of mud and pine needles. Every step felt like a hammer blow to my ribs. The air was thin and tasted of iron. I didn't think about the pain. I thought about Emma's face. I thought about the way she'd looked in that red coat, her eyes full of hope. I thought about how I'd failed her father, and how I wouldn't fail her. I reached the tree line just as the sun broke over the horizon. The ridge was bathed in a blinding, golden light that made everything look ethereal and fake. Julian's SUV was parked at the very edge of the cliff, its front tires inches from the drop. Julian was standing outside the driver's side door. He had Sarah by the arm, her face a mask of bruised terror. Emma was in the back seat, her face pressed against the glass, her hands beating a silent, frantic rhythm on the window. But it was what Julian was holding in his other hand that made my blood freeze. It wasn't a gun, it was a flare. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Julian shouted into the wind. He didn't see me yet. I was behind the old stone wall of the memorial, 20 yards away. "This is where you left her, isn't it, Dad? This is where you put Mom." In the dirt. I stepped out from behind the wall, the Glock raised and steady. "Julian, step away from the car." He spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, something that had been beaten until only the teeth were left. "Look at you," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with a poisonous cocktail of hatred and jealousy. "The hero. Even when you're dying, you can't help but play the part. Did you take your pills, Archer? Or did you accidentally take the ones I left for you?" "I took the ones that matter," I said, moving an inch closer. "The ones that keep me standing. Now let Sarah go." "Why? So she can testify? So she can tell the world what a monster I am?" He pulled Sarah closer, the flare hovering near her face. "She was part of it, you know. She liked the money. She liked the fancy apartment in the towers. She didn't ask questions until the bills came due. She's just as guilty as I am." "That's a lie," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "I never wanted any of it, Julian. I wanted you." "You wanted a winner," he roared back. "And now you've got one, because in 5 minutes, I'm going to be the only one left to tell the story. The tragic accident on the ridge. A family destroyed by the grief of their patriarch's death." He looked at me, a sickening grin spreading across his face. "You think I'm going to kill them, Dad? No, I'm going to let them watch. I'm going to let them watch you die of a broken heart, right here where you buried Mom. And then, I'm going to save them. I'm going to be the grieving son who rescued his family from his suicidal father, the hero of the story." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote. My heart skipped a beat. "What is that?" I asked. "The digital backup," he said. "The one David didn't find. The one that proves you were the one who moved the money. The one that shows you were the one who bought the aconitine on the dark web." I've been building a digital ghost of you for months, Archer. Every search, every purchase, every confession, it's all tied to your IP. Once I press this button, it uploads to the PD's server. He was going to frame me. Even if I killed him, even if I saved the girls, I would die a criminal in the eyes of the world. He had spent months curating a version of me that was a murderer. You won't do it, I said, my voice shaking. I already have, he whispered. At that moment, the ground beneath the SUV groaned. The heavy rains had softened the soil of the ridge, and the weight of the vehicle was too much. The front tires slipped another inch. Emma screamed a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that sliced through the morning air. Julian's bravado vanished. For a split second, the father in him overrode the psychopath. He lunged for the car, trying to grab the door handle, but the movement only made the soil shift faster. "Emma!" he yelled. The car began to tilt. Sarah was thrown to the ground as Julian lost his grip on her. He was sliding toward the edge, his boots clawing at the mud. I had a choice. I could run for Sarah, who was shivering on the ground. I could run for Julian, who was inches from falling. Or I could go for the car. I didn't think. I sprinted. I reached the rear bumper of the SUV just as the back tires left the ground. I threw my weight against the frame, my heart screaming in protest, a white-hot explosion of pain blooming behind my eyes. I felt the metal bite into my shoulder. "Archer!" Frank's voice echoed from the road. The sirens finally close. I was holding 2 tons of steel with nothing but my failing body and the memory of a 10-year-old's laughter. Through the back window, I saw Emma. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, her small hands pressed against the glass. "Grandpa," she mouthed. And then I felt it. The snap, not in the car, in my chest. The pain wasn't a spike anymore. It was a flood. The world went dark at the edges. My grip began to slip. Julian was right there, his hand reaching for the bumper, his eyes full of a sudden, pathetic plea for life. "Dad," he sobbed, "help me." I looked at my son. I looked at the man who had killed my wife and tried to erase my life. And then I looked at Emma. I made the only choice a father could make. But as the car shifted one last time, Julian didn't reach for the bumper to save himself. He reached for something else. What he did in those final seconds changed the ending of our story in a way I never saw coming. The mud was slick, a slurry of gravel and gray earth that wanted to pull everything into the gorge. My feet were sliding, my boots finding no purchase, as the weight of the SUV tried to drag me over. But Julian wasn't reaching for the car. He wasn't reaching for the father, who was currently acting as the only anchor between his daughter and a 100-foot drop. His hand was clawing through the muck for that black remote. "The upload," he hissed, his face contorted in a mask of pure, frantic malice. "It's 90%. You're done, Archer. You're finished." He didn't care that the SUV was tilting further, the metal groaning as the frame twisted. He didn't care that Emma's screams were getting weaker, her oxygen likely thinning as the car's rear settled into the soft earth. He only cared about the lie. He wanted to die knowing that the world would remember me as the man who poisoned his own friend. I felt the snap in my chest again, but this time it was followed by a terrifying coldness. It started at my fingertips and raced up my arms, a numbing frost that told me my heart was finally, truly, giving up. My vision began to tunnel, the golden morning light turning into a pinprick of white at the end of a long, dark hallway. "Julian," I wheezed, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Look at her. Look at your daughter." "She's a witness," he screamed, his fingers finally closing around the remote. "You don't get it, do you? I'm the only one who survives this. I'm the victim." He thumbed the button. A small blue light on the remote blinked 3 times the signal that the upload was complete. A look of triumph, so grotesque it didn't look human, washed over his face. He let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. He had won. He had erased 40 years of service and replaced it with a digital ghost of a killer. In that moment of triumph, he forgot where he was standing. The soil beneath his left boot disintegrated. It didn't just slide, it vanished. Julian's laugh turned into a sharp, panicked gasp as he tumbled backward. He reached out, his fingers brushing the bumper of the car I was still holding, but there was nothing for him to grab. The remote flew from his hand, spinning into the abyss like a discarded toy. He didn't scream as he went over. He just stared at me, his eyes wide, the realization of his own stupidity finally dawning on him. Then, he was gone. The sound of him hitting the brush below was muffled by the roar of the wind. I was alone. My heart was a stuttering, dying engine, and I was holding 2 tons of metal that wanted to follow my son into the dark. "Grandpa," Emma's voice. It was the only thing that kept the darkness from closing in. I dug my heels into the muck, my muscles screaming, my vision flickering like a dying light bulb. I couldn't pull it back. I could only hold it. "Archer, hold on," Frank's voice. Then the sound of heavy engines, real ones. A winch cable hissed through the air, the steel hook clattering against the SUV's frame. I felt the tension shift as the police tow truck took the weight. Strong hands grabbed my shoulders, pulling me back from the edge, dragging me away from the crumbling earth. I collapsed onto the grass, my lungs burning, my chest feeling like it had been caved in by a sledgehammer. I watched, through a blur of tears and gray haze, as the old guard and the SWAT team swarmed the car. They pried the door open. They pulled Emma out. She ran past the officers, past her mother who was sobbing on the ground, and threw herself onto my chest. "Grandpa, wake up. Please wake up." I tried to tell her I was there. I tried to tell her I wasn't going anywhere, but the darkness was too heavy now. I felt the prick of a needle in my arm, Doctor. Brennan, who must have followed the convoy. "He's in VFib," someone shouted. "Clear." The world bucked beneath me as the paddles hit my chest. Once, twice. I spiraled down into a dreamless, quiet dark. I woke up 3 days later, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. The light was soft, filtered through thin white curtains. My chest felt like it was being held together by wire and prayer. Frank Miller was sitting in a chair by the window, a newspaper in his lap. He looked like he hadn't slept since the ridge. When he saw my eyes open, he didn't smile. He just let out a long, shaky breath and leaned forward. "You're a hard man to kill, Archer Dalton," he said. "Julian," I rasped. Frank hesitated. "He survived the fall, caught a ledge 20 feet down. He's in the prison ward at the county hospital. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding. He'll live, but he won't be walking for a long time." I closed my eyes, a wave of complicated grief washing over me. "The upload, Frank, the remote. He sent the files. He framed me." Frank stood up and walked over to the bed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small thumb drive. "He sent the files, all right," Frank said, a grim smile finally touching his lips. "But he didn't send them to the PD server. He sent them to a redirected port we set up the night before." I frowned, the fog in my brain clearing. "What? Remember Catherine Walsh, the tech expert? She didn't just find the hack, Archer. She mirrored Julian's entire system. The moment he tried to upload those confessions, the system rerouted them to a secure server we controlled. We didn't just get the fake files he tried to frame you with, we got the source code. We got the original drafts of the forged will. We got the search history for the Akhenaten. We got everything." "He framed himself," I whispered. "In high definition," Frank agreed. "He didn't just provide us with a confession. He provided us with the blueprint of his entire conspiracy. The prosecutor is calling it the most complete evidence package they've ever seen. He's looking at 30 years, Archer. Minimum." I lay there for a long time, listening to the steady beep, beep, beep of my heart monitor. It was a rhythmic, artificial sound, but it was the sound of life. My son was alive, but he was gone. David was alive. Emma was safe. But as I looked at the thumb drive in Frank's hand, I realized something. The revenge wasn't the prison sentence. It wasn't the fall. The real revenge was what Julian didn't know yet. "Frank," I said, my voice gaining a bit of its old steel. "What about the second insurance policy? The one for Kate?" Frank's face darkened. "We found the records, Archer. The pharmacy in the next county. The propranolol. It was Julian's signature on the pickup. We're adding second-degree murder to the docket." The room went cold. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. My son hadn't just been a gambler. He had been a predator who had fed on his own family for years. "I want to see him," I said. "Archer, the doctors say you need rest." "I don't need rest, Frank. I need to finish this. Take me to the hospital. I have one last thing to give my son." Frank saw the look in my eyes, the look that had made me the best detective in the county for 20 years. He didn't argue. He went to get a wheelchair. When we reached the prison ward, the air felt different. It was heavy with the scent of bleach and the silent weight of iron bars. Julian was in room bone, his body encased in a complex web of casts and traction wires. He looked small. He looked broken. When he saw me wheeling into the room, the hatred in his eyes flickered, but it was replaced by something else. Fear. You're supposed to be dead, he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. I've spent 40 years dealing with people like you, Julian, I said, my voice calm and cold. I know how to survive. But you never learned the most important rule of the game. And what's that? He sneered, trying to find a shred of his old arrogance. You never ever underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. I reached into the bag Frank had brought and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was the one from the creek, Julian at 8 years old, holding the trout. I set it on the bedside table, right where he could see it. I'm not here to yell at you, Julian. I'm not even here to tell you I hate you. I'm here to tell you that this boy, the one in the picture, he's the only one I'm going to remember. The man in this bed, he doesn't exist to me anymore. You think I care? Julian laughed, but it turned into a cough that made him wince in pain. I'm your legacy, Archer. Every time people hear the name Dalton, they'll think of me. No, I said, leaning forward. That's the thing you missed. I spent this morning with Thomas Whitmore. We filed the paperwork for a name change. Sarah and Emma are no longer Castellanianos. They're Daltons again. And as for you, I pulled out a legal document and set it on his chest. I'm disinheriting you. Every cent, every stick of furniture, every memory of this family is going into a trust for Emma. You are officially a stranger to this bloodline. Julian stared at the paper, his face turning a sickly shade of white. You can't do that. I'm your son. My son died a long time ago, I said, signaling for Frank to wheel me out. I just didn't realize it until the ridge. As we reached the door, I stopped and looked back one last time. Oh, and Julian, the upload you sent, the one you thought would destroy me? He looked up, his eyes narrow. The police didn't just get the files. They got the audio from the cabin. They heard you confess to killing your mother. They heard you admit that you'd let Emma die just to win a point. I let that sink in. I let him see the void he'd created for himself. What happened next changed everything, I whispered to myself as the door clicked shut. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist in Julian's plan hadn't come from him. It had come from Kate, and it was waiting for me back at the house. The discharge from the hospital felt less like a release and more like a transfer to a different kind of prison. The silence of my home, usually a comfort, now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. I walked through the front door, my chest still bound in medical tape, my movements slow and deliberate, like a man navigating a minefield. The house was cold. I hadn't bothered to turn the heat on before the ridge, and the October chill had settled into the walls, seeping into the floorboards and the furniture. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the poisoned vodka had sat, where the forged will had been discussed, where my world had shattered. I looked at the spot where the bottle had been, half expecting to see a ghost of the amber liquid. Instead, I saw only the faint ring of dust where I'd failed to clean properly. I'm home, Kate, I whispered. But for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel like she was there. It was as if the revelations about Julian had sucked the warmth out of her memory, leaving only the cold, clinical facts of her death. She hadn't died of a natural progression. She'd died because our son was a bookkeeper who viewed her life as an unbalanced ledger. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit in the quiet and let the rage eat me from the inside out. I stood up, the pain in my chest a dull roar, and walked toward the bedroom. I needed to clear out Kate's things. I'd been holding on to her clothes, her books, her sewing kit, as if they were talismans that could bring her back. But now, they felt like evidence. I started in the closet. The scent of her lavender detergent still clung to her sweaters, a bittersweet ghost of a life that felt 1,000 years away. I packed them into boxes, my hands steady, my mind a cold, focused engine. I was a detective again, and I was clearing a scene. By the time I reached her sewing kit, a large vintage wooden box she'd inherited from her grandmother, the sun was beginning to set. I opened the lid, expecting to find the usual tangle of thread and needles, but as I lifted the top tray, I noticed something off. The velvet lining at the bottom was slightly loose in one corner. My detective's brain, the one Julian thought was a relic, went into overdrive. I pulled a small seam ripper from the tray and carefully eased the lining up. Tucked beneath the velvet was a small silver key and a sealed envelope. My heart did that stuttering skip again, but this time, it wasn't an attack. It was adrenaline. I recognized Kate's handwriting on the envelope. It was addressed to me, but the date at the bottom was from 6 years ago, a full year before she'd been diagnosed. For Archer, when the silence becomes too loud. I sat on the edge of our bed, the envelope heavy in my lap. I tore it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a list of numbers that looked like bank account codes. "Archer," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I'm no longer there to keep the peace. I know you think I don't see the way Julian looks at us, the way he calculates the cost of the things we give him. I know you think I don't notice the money missing from the emergency fund. I saw it all, my love. I just didn't want to break your heart by telling you." I felt a sob build in my throat, but I forced myself to keep reading. "Julian has a darkness in him that neither of us wants to admit. He inherited your strength, Archer, but he didn't inherit your soul. He thinks he's smarter than us. He thinks he can outrun the life we built. I've been putting money aside not in our joint accounts, but in a separate trust I set up through a cousin in Seattle. The key is for a safe deposit box at the Ridgeview National Bank. Inside, you'll find the records of every cent he stole from us over the years. I documented it all. Not to punish him, but to protect you. If he ever tries to come for the house, or for you, use this. Don't let him take what we built together." I looked at the silver key. Kate hadn't been oblivious. She'd been a silent guardian, watching from the wings while I played the hero cop. She'd seen the monster in Julian before he'd even learned how to hide it. I didn't wait for morning. I called David Whitmore. He was back at home, his voice sounding stronger than it had a week ago. "David, I found something. Something Kate left behind." "Archer, what is it?" "A failsafe. I need you to meet me at the bank tomorrow morning. We're going to open a safe deposit box." The next morning, the bank was quiet. The scent of old paper and air conditioning, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. David met me in the lobby, leaning on a cane but looking sharp in a navy blazer. We were led back to the vault by a young teller who didn't know she was helping us finish a war. The box clicked open. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of printed emails. I started flipping through the ledger. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Kate had tracked every withdrawal, every loan. Julian had never paid back, every credit card charge that didn't belong to us. But as I reached the back of the book, I found something that made even my seasoned detective's heart go cold. It was a copy of a life insurance policy Julian had taken out on himself 6 years ago. But the beneficiary wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Emma. It was the Benetti family. "David, look at this," I said, sliding the policy across the table. David adjusted his glasses, his eyes widening as he read the fine print. "This isn't just a policy, Archer. This is a debt repayment contract. Julian didn't just owe them $300,000. He'd signed over his life to them as a guarantee for a much larger operation. He was laundering money for them through his tech startup. The pieces finally locked into place. Julian hadn't just tried to kill me for the insurance money to pay a debt. He was trying to buy his way out of a much larger, much darker commitment. He was a small-time crook who had stepped into a deep-sea trench, and he was trying to use his family as a ladder to climb out." "There's more," I said, pointing to a set of bank statements at the bottom of the box. They were for an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The balance was over $2 million. "He's been hiding money for years," I whispered. "While he was asking us for bridge loans and investments, he was sitting on millions of the Benettis' money. He wasn't drowning, David. He was skimming. The real reason the Benettis were after him wasn't because he couldn't pay. It was because they'd figured out he was stealing from them. Vinnie Russo hadn't been there to collect a debt. He'd been there to reclaim the laundered funds before Julian could vanish. He played everyone," David said, his voice full of disgust. "He played the mob, he played the police, he played his own wife, and he almost killed us both to cover his tracks. He forgot one thing," I said, standing up. "He forgot that Kate kept receipts." I felt a sudden, cold clarity. I didn't just want Julian in prison for 30 years. I wanted him to understand that every move he'd made, every brilliant hack, every airtight plan, had been seen and documented by the woman he thought he'd outsmarted. I looked at David. "We're going to the prosecutor, but we're not just giving them the evidence for the attempted murder. We're giving them the money laundering. We're giving them the Benetti connection. I want Julian to be the most valuable witness the feds have ever had, and I want him to know that I'm the one who turned him. Archer, if you do that, the Benettis will never let him survive in prison. He'll have a target on his back from day one." "He had a target on mine for 3 years," I said, my voice as hard as flint. "He can learn what it feels like." We spent the next 4 hours with the district attorney and a representative from the FBI. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the world felt different. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. I was a man who had finally finished his last case. But as I reached my truck, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered it, expecting another threat or a taunt from one of Julian's associates. "Detective Dalton?" The voice was female, low, and sounded like it was coming from a crowded place. "Who is this?" "My name is Maria. I'm the nurse who was on duty in the ICU the night David Whitmore was poisoned. You remember the loop, Detective? The one Frank Miller said they fed into the system." "I remember. What about it?" "The loop was real, Archer. But the video wasn't of a dummy. It was of Julian. He was in the room that night. He was the one who authorized the transfer of the patient." "Transfer? What transfer?" David was in the third-floor secure wing. There was a long pause on the other line. I could hear the sound of an ambulance siren in the background. "David Whitmore never made it to the third floor, Archer. He was moved to a private facility in Portland on Julian's orders, 2 hours before the SWAT team arrived." The world seemed to stop spinning. I looked at the courthouse I'd just left, at the papers in my hand that I'd thought were the final nail in my son's coffin. "Where is he now, Maria?" "That's the thing, Detective. The facility in Portland? It doesn't exist. Julian didn't just try to kill you. He's been holding your best friend as a bargaining chip for the Benitez. He wasn't trying to finish the job at the Ridge. He was waiting for a call." I realized then that the war wasn't over. Julian had one last open loop, one final piece of leverage he hadn't played yet. He'd let me think I'd won, let me think I'd disinherited him and destroyed his legacy, while he held the only person I had left in a place I couldn't find. "Archer, are you there?" Maria's voice was fading. "I'm here," I said, my voice a whisper. What happened next changed everything. I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal wasn't about the money or the insurance. It was about a choice I'd made 40 years ago, a secret I'd kept even from Kate, a secret that Julian had finally uncovered. I looked down at the silver key in my hand. It didn't just open a safe deposit box, it opened a door to a past I thought I'd buried. And standing right behind my truck, leaning against the fender with a look of bored patience, was Vinnie Russo. "You got the ledger, didn't you, Archer?" Vinnie said, lighting a cigarette. "Good. Now you're going to tell me where the rest of the money is, or David dies for real this time." The smoke from Vinnie's cigarette curled into the damp evening air, a gray ribbon that looked like a ghost escaping a grave. He stood there, leaning against my truck with a casual arrogance that made my blood boil, but I didn't reach for the Glock Frank had given me. Not yet. I was a man with a damaged heart and a body held together by surgical tape, but I was still a detective, and I knew when a man was holding a losing hand while trying to bluff his way to the pot. "You're a long way from the city, Vinnie," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "And you're a long way from the Benitez's good graces if you're still chasing Julian's scraps." Vinnie didn't flinch. He just flicked an ash onto the pavement and looked at the silver key I was still clutching in my left hand. "Julian's scraps? Archer, you're missing the bigger picture. Julian wasn't just skimming from the Benitez. He was playing a much older game. One that started 40 years ago when a young patrolman named Archer Dalton made a choice that cost a very important man a very large amount of freedom. The world seemed to go quiet, the sound of the traffic on the nearby highway fading into a dull hum. 40 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the winter of Mutngin Chincham, the warehouse bust on the docks. The night I'd found a briefcase full of ledgers, and a man named Lorenzo Benetti begging me to walk away in exchange for a lifetime of consulting fees. I'd turned him in. I'd walked the straight line, even when the rest of the precinct was leaning. "Your son found the old records, Archer," Vinnie continued, his eyes narrowing. "He found out that the man who sent his mother to the grave and his father to the Ridge was the same man you put in a cell for 20 years. Julian didn't just want your insurance money. He wanted to give the Benitez a peace offering. He wanted to deliver you to them on a silver platter, along with the $2 million he'd skimmed back for them. He was buying his way into the family by selling out his own." The revelation settled in my gut like cold lead. Julian's hatred wasn't just about my rules or my disappointments. It was a twisted form of revenge for a past he'd reconstructed from old police files and the whispers of criminals. He thought I was a hypocrite. He thought my honor was a cage I'd built for him. "Where's David?" I asked, my grip tightening on the key. "David is at the old cannery at the mouth of the river," Vinnie said, tossing his cigarette away. "He's fine for now." but Lorenzo's son, Sal, is waiting for that key. Julian told him it opens a box with the original ledgers from Tamuisao, the ones you supposedly kept as insurance. I looked at the silver key. It didn't open a box of ledgers. It opened the safe deposit box I'd just emptied, the one containing Kate's accounting of Julian's crimes. Kate had known. She'd known about the Benetti connection. She'd known that Julian was digging into my past, and she'd left me the only thing that could save David and end this cycle for good. "Tell Sal I'm coming," I said, "and tell him to bring David. If I see a single shadow that shouldn't be there, I'll drop this key into the river, and the ledgers go to the feds via a dead man's switch I set up an hour ago." Vinny nodded, a flicker of genuine apprehension in his eyes. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He'd seen what I was capable of at the Ridge. He climbed into his car and sped off, leaving me alone in the darkening parking lot. I drove toward the cannery, the pain in my chest a constant, rhythmic reminder that my time was running out. I didn't call Frank. This wasn't a police matter anymore. It was a debt that had been accruing interest for 4 decades, and I was the only one who could pay it. The cannery was a skeleton of rusted iron and rotting wood, standing over the black water of the river like a sentinel. I parked my truck and walked toward the light spilling from the open bay doors. Inside, I saw a black SUV and 3 men. One was Vinny, the second was a man in a sharp, dark suit, Sal Benetti, and the third was David, tied to a chair, his face bruised, but his eyes bright with a defiance that made me proud to call him my friend. "Archer," David croaked. "Don't do it. It's not worth it." "Shut up, David," I said softly, stepping into the circle of light. Sal Benetti stepped forward, his face a younger, hungrier version of his father's. "The ledgers, detective. Give me the key, and you both walk. My father wants his history erased. Julian promised us. You were the keeper of the secrets." "Julian was a fool," I said, holding up the silver key. "He thought he could trade my life for his soul, but he forgot that my wife was the one who kept the books in this family." I didn't give him the key. Instead, I pulled out the leather-bound ledger Kate had left in the safe deposit box. I opened it to the middle, to the section where she'd pasted the original documents I'd supposedly kept as insurance. "Your father didn't go to jail because of these ledgers, Sal," I said, my voice steady despite the roar of my heart. "He went to jail because he was betrayed by his own lieutenant. My partner back then, a man named Silas, was the one who gave us the location of the warehouse. I just made the arrest. These ledgers? They don't prove your father's guilt. They prove that your family has been paying a pension to the man who ratted him out for the last 40 years. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the gears turning in Sal's head, the sudden, violent shift in his reality. The Benettis had been hunting a ghost, while the real traitor was likely sitting at their Sunday dinner. Julian found the ledgers, but he didn't read them. I continued. He just saw the names and the numbers and assumed I was a dirty cop. He was so blinded by his need to hurt me that he handed you the evidence of your own family's betrayal. I tossed the ledger onto the floor at Sal's feet. "Take it, read the names. You'll find Silas is living in a villa in Cabo, paid for with Benetti money. David and I are leaving now. If you try to stop us, the digital copies of that ledger, the ones that include the current skimming Julian was doing for you, go to the FBI." Sal didn't look at me. He was staring at the ledger, his face pale with a cold, murderous rage. He gestured to Vinny. "Let them go." Vinny cut David's zip ties. I caught my friend as he stumbled, his weight heavy against my aching chest. We walked out of the cannery and into the cold night, the sound of the river the only witness to our escape. We were 3 miles down the road before David finally spoke. "How did you know, Archer, about Silas?" "I didn't," I admitted, the exhaustion finally hitting me. "Kate did. She'd been tracking the payments for years. She knew Silas was the one who'd set everything in motion. She kept the proof, as a way to protect us, if the Benettis ever came knocking. She was a better cop than I ever was, David." I dropped David off at the hospital, where Margaret was waiting with a look of relief that could have lit up the entire city. I didn't stay. I had one last stop to make. I drove back to the county hospital, to the prison ward. I walked past the guards, my badge, the real one, the one I'd earned with 40 years of blood and sweat getting me through the final door. Julian was awake. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no smile, no arrogance. Just the hollow, haunted look of a man who had realized he'd burned his own house down while he was still inside. "The Benettis know, Julian," I said, standing at the foot of his bed. They know about Silas, and they know you were skimming from them. I gave them the ledger. Julian's eyes went wide. You killed me. They'll come for me in here. No, I said, leaning in. I didn't kill you. I gave you exactly what you wanted. You wanted to be part of that world, Julian. You wanted to be a player. Well, now you're the most important player in the room. The feds are coming for you in an hour. You're going to tell them everything you know about the Benitez's current operations. You're going to trade your life for their freedom. They'll kill me anyway, he whispered. Probably, I said, and the word didn't even hurt to say. But that's the choice you made. You gambled with my life, with David's life, with Emma's life. You lost. Now, the debt is due. I turned to leave, but I stopped at the door. One more thing. Emma asked about you today. She asked if you'd ever find your way back. Julian looked at me, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. I told her no, I said. I told her that some people are just born without a compass. I told her that she doesn't have to worry about you anymore. Because as far as this family is concerned, Julian Castellano doesn't exist. I walked out of the room, the sound of the heart monitor's steady beep following me down the hall. The final resolution didn't happen in a courtroom or a hospital. It happened a week later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of pine and damp earth. I was back at the ridge, standing by the memorial bench I'd finally fixed. The sun was warm on my back, and the pain in my chest had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. Emma was there, sitting on the bench with a sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing the gorge, her small hands moving with a confidence that reminded me of Kate. Sarah was a few yards away, planting a new batch of lavender near the stone wall. They were Daltons now, truly Daltons. I sat down beside Emma, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. "Grandpa," she said softly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Is the story over now?" I looked out over the gorge, at the place where the shadows were finally being pushed back by the light. I thought about the $4,000 bottle of vodka, the forged wills, and the 40-year-old secrets. I thought about the son I'd lost, and the family I'd fought to keep. "The old story is over, Emma," I said, kissing the top of her head. "But the new one, that one's just beginning." I realized then that revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about outliving them. It's about standing in the light they tried to take from you and refusing to let it go out. Julian was a ghost in a cell, a man without a name or a legacy. But here, on the ridge, the air was clear, the roots were deep, and the silence wasn't a shroud anymore. It was peace. I looked at the sketchbook. Emma had drawn the three of us, her, Sarah, and me, standing by the old maple tree. We weren't perfect, and we weren't whole, but we were there. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. What is the one thing you would fight to protect, no matter the cost to your own heart?